and ends up conquering the Aztec Empire. 9 years later, Pizarro goes from the Caribbean to Panama, down the west coast, and conquers the Inca Empire. People go up through the southwest in the United States. It is the launching pad for things. And as that's going on, they are mining and mining and mining the gold. And by 1520, they're pretty convinced the gold is mined out in the major Caribbean islands. They start moving the encomienda system to the mainland. Now, as this is going on, it's being widely debated in Spain because news gets back of the death. You can't have this many people. By the way, the natives weren't killed. They died of disease. We call this virgin soil epidemics. That is, when you have never been exposed to a single disease in your life and suddenly you get it in spades. The normal diseases that you and I might sneeze and whine and stay in bed for 3 days and take an aspirin were killing people. These diseases would come, and they were because they had no defenses against them whatsoever. And as the population gets removed from the Caribbean, as Africans get brought in, stories in Spain abound everywhere of the cruelty of the system. And in 1542, the encomienda system is declared illegal. Okay. This ushers in the next era. Oh, here's, by the way, a system. Picture of gold mining. Pretty stylized, by the way, and written much later, and very untrue to the reality of the way life looked. But you get a certain sense of the nature of it. You see mines and people going in the earth. Okay. The second era, piracy and early European rivalry. Now, from its early position in the Caribbean, Spain became the dominant power in Europe. The Spanish called the 16th century, by the way, the Siglo de Oro, the century of gold. And their power in Europe was strange. Charles, the first of Spain, the king of Spain, called himself Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And his idea was to knit Europe back together in one big, glorious empire, and Spain would be at the head of it, and the Spanish king would be also the Spanish Holy Roman Emperor. Come in. The idea then is that Spain becomes the dominant power, but I always kind of looked at Spain's power in the 16th century a bit like Saudi Arabia's might be in the 1960s or 70s. It's based on an artificial thing. You know, a country gets petroleum suddenly, and they're a rich country. But they don't have the things that make a country really rich. What makes a country rich? An educated citizenry, a rule of law, public traditions, citizen involvement, certain things that build capital in human beings. When you get gold being poured, it's like adrenaline, constant political adrenaline. So Spain is this incredibly powerful country, but it uses this gold to buy armies, to try to conquer much of Europe, by the way, which it did not. It was pretty unsuccessful. And the rest of Europe is looking on and not liking what it sees. And this starts the second era. When the rest of Europe gets involved in the Caribbean, for the first 80 years, they get involved as pirates. Now, all of the 16th century saw a European war between Spain against almost everyone else, especially the Dutch and especially the English, because the Dutch and English were Protestant, Spain was Catholic. And you can't believe how vicious the warfare was between Catholics and Protestants. 1/3 of the Germanic states were killed in these wars, the 30 Years' War, because of the vicious fighting of Christian against Christian. But when you fight within your own religion, by the way, you're not fighting an enemy, you're fighting a heretic. And that makes it all the more intense. You're fighting someone who's destroying the true belief from within. So how does the rest of Europe get back? They get back by piracy. They get back by sending crews to the Caribbean to steal Spanish convoys of gold. And after the 1540s, the Spanish all started sending ships back with metals to Europe with 4 or 5 or 6 in a convoy and a couple of other ships with soldiers on board. Even so, they would get picked off because it was hard to keep a convoy. Look at the sea today. It's hard to keep a convoy together when you're using sail that way. And the piracy took on 2 forms, by the way. One were genuine pirates. You know, the nasty bully you know in your neighborhood gets a bunch of guys together, they go out and rob you. That's one kind. But most of the piracy was something called privateering. And here's how privateering works. If England's at war with Spain, a bunch of English sailors will go to the English monarch and say, look, we want to attack Spain and help England. So if you give us a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, we will seize Spanish gold. And in turn of you authorizing us to do this, we will give you a negotiated amount, 15%, 20%. So most of the piracy was what was called legal piracy, privateering. You get a letter from a monarch in Europe who's at war with another country. Now, one of the strange things is, in this time, there are maybe 400 Germanic little states. Someone's always at war with someone. You can be English, by the way, and if you're not technically at war with Spain, you go to some little place in Germany that is, they'll give you a letter so you can attack Spanish shipping. And we think of those famous English pirates, Blackbeard, probably, don't we? Blackbeard made himself look crazy by putting stuff in his beard, and he was vicious, okay. Blackbeard is probably the most famous to North Americans and to Caribbean people. The most famous, really, at the time was Sir Francis Drake. Now, we don't think of Francis Drake being a pirate. Now, look at this picture. This is Sir Francis Drake being knighted by Queen Elizabeth. We think of him as being a glorious English citizen. In England today, there are statues everywhere of Francis Drake. He went home after his career as a privateer to be mayor of Plymouth, elected a member of Parliament, a very dominant, powerful English politician for 30 years in his life, honored and loved and revered everywhere. He was the most feared person on the Atlantic for 30 years of his life. Now, it's interesting, when the Dutch and English privateers captured a Spanish convoy, they killed all the people. They killed them because they were Catholic. When the French captured them, they just set them adrift in little boats, being more humanitarian because they were also fellow Catholics. But this is an era of incredible bloodthirstiness, but the European role is to grab the loot from other people and take it home and reduce Spain. And by the way, in this great era, of course, the great moment when Spain did become reduced was 1588. You all took Western Civ. What happened in 1588? The Spanish Armada is defeated. And by the way, the Spanish Armada being defeated was in sight of London. It was thousands. It's the nearest thing to Dunkirk we see today. You know, all those boats of one little place going on. It was, but from 1588, Spain has gone downhill in European power, and other countries have moved in to take the place. And this is the third. How am I doing on time, by the way? This is the third era. One of the dangers of not having regular bells go off as I shoot my mouth off too long. This is the third era. England, France, Netherlands, and Denmark move in. And I say by moving in, I mean they begin their own settlements. England moves to St. Kitts in 1623, and a mere 12 years later had 6 more colonies. In 13 years, it has 7 colonies. The French also started in St. Kitts, the other half of the island, in 1623, and established 3 more colonies. The Dutch settled St. Martin's in 1631, 3 more very quickly afterwards. The Danish lagged a bit behind, but came in late in the 17th century. Sweden was expected to be a major player. Sweden was gearing up to be a major player. Sweden got involved in wars with Russia and on the continent with the Polish-Lithuanian state, and Sweden never quite became the dominant power. It bought 2 colonies in the 18th century. But the point is, the Spanish lake is suddenly no longer a Spanish lake. The Spanish lake becomes a European lake. And in several of these islands, the Spanish had no power, had no real establishment, no inhabitants. They still thought of every inch of the Caribbean should be theirs, and they still resented every single Englishman, Frenchman, Dutchman, or Scandinavian who came here. And after this, in this era, there is constant warfare between the European countries, Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and each other. And the warfare takes place both in Europe and in the Caribbean. Now, as they're doing this, they're trying to find some reason to be here, because they all thought of gold. But when the gold gives out, they thought, what are we doing down here? What can happen? They all started raising tobacco in this era. They all started raising cotton, and they made some success, but it wasn't a huge, bountiful crop they were getting. And then, in the middle of the century, in the 1660s, a few Dutch settlers brought back some sugar cane from Brazil. And then, fair to say, all hell broke loose. That is, the islands were so incredibly well suited to sugar cane production. It's funny how an area sometimes has a crop meant for it. Virginia and Maryland had tobacco. South Carolina had rice. Georgia, they thought, had silk, by the way. Georgia was to be the silk colony because the mulberry tree grows wild in Georgia. Turns out there are 2 kinds of mulberry trees, black and white. The Georgia mulberry trees aren't so good, but Georgia became great for cotton, and then the islands down here became great for sugar. So all these countries that are warring with each other, they all turn to sugar production. So you get more diversity in one sense in the Caribbean with all these European countries feuding, but you get something else. You get agreement on the economy, sugar production. Sugar was immensely productive and profitable. For one thing, it was in short supply in the world. It was very, very precious. Sugar today, by the way, is so dirt cheap. I think most comes from sugar beets. Like, you go to North Dakota, you'll see mountains of sugar beets in the fields. You say, what are they for? Sugar. They grow these beets, they heap them in fields. But at the time, sugar was very precious, very rare, very hard to get, and it made the Caribbean the most profitable part of most empires. The English always considered the Caribbean by far the most prosperous part. Forget Massachusetts, forget Virginia, forget Georgia, forget New Hampshire, the West Indies. By 1700, almost all Europeans did not refer to these as the West Indies or the Caribbean. They called them the Sugar Islands. Is anyone else here from Canada? You are. Good. Okay, where are you from? What city? Outside, yeah, also, or? Thunder, oh, you're near me. I'm from Winnipeg, so and? Niagara Falls, okay. Montreal, oh, I didn't see you back there. I'm sorry. Hello, sir. I went there on my honeymoon. Nice. And anyway, the reason I'm asking this is, you probably know that in 1759, England conquered New France. And these were, this was the fourth war between England and France that had gone on, and it was a titanic battle for control of the North American continent. And the price paid by the English and the French, of course, was immense. If you've ever been to Quebec City, you don't want to climb up those cliffs to try to storm the darn place. There's a fort on top. But the English did, they conquered it, and at the end of the war, they gave France the following option in the Treaty of Paris. You can either have Canada back or keep Guadeloupe and Martinique. These are your choices. All of Canada or Guadeloupe and Martinique. And the French took the two islands. No. There's not a Canadian today that doesn't feel mildly insulted by that. But this tells you of how, this is regarded as a frozen Northland as opposed to these incredibly productive sugar islands. So sugar produced profit. It made this place the center of the Atlantic world in terms of colonial possessions. It also had, however, some really serious downsides. It was incredibly labor intensive. African slaves have been imported since really 1506, 1507, but in fairly small numbers. Now all European powers resorted to importing African slaves in huge numbers. It also was produced usually on giant plantations. And the slaves went from groups of 5 and 10 and 15 to the average being gangs of 250. And this had another effect on the social structure. It drove whites out. Most of South and North Carolina and Southern Virginia were settled by Caribbean whites leaving the Caribbean going north. Because you have these gangs, you have overseers, you have absentee owners and huge gangs of white plantations, of black slaves. There's almost no role for a small little freeholder. A guy who has 50 acres, a mule, a farm, wants to raise some cheese and do some things. The entire region becomes committed to one, sugar production, African labor, and a small number of white overseers. Now, the social structure became, by any way of looking at it, depressed. One of the interesting things is the demography of the African slave population. About 2/3 male, 1/3 female, but they made the deliberate decision usually to work slaves to death and not encourage reproduction. When you're having a baby, you're not strong and powerful. You often die during childbirth. The baby requires a lot of care. The decision was made, it was cheaper to bring in more slaves than to take care of the ones they had. A different decision, by the way, was made in Virginia and Maryland, and it has great consequences for the demography. So it meant a constant, never-ending supply of slavery, and it meant, of course, that the slaves lived in abject conditions. Not just the absence of freedom, which in its own sense is obviously horrible, but it meant they lived under conditions where concern for their health was not a big deal, and the mortality rate was just astounding. The other thing it did was they wanted every square inch for sugar production. So if there were trees, if there were other things, they raised those things and put the whole thing in, and they completely stopped raising food. This had the strange effect of dramatically affecting New England, the Hudson Valley, and Pennsylvania, because no food for the slaves or the white overseers was raised in the Caribbean. By 1710, 1715, almost all the food came from New England. And New England changed its trade to be a Caribbean trade. The Hudson Valley and Pennsylvania the same way. So sugar changed, the way the world ate. The world got sugar, which they liked. It made a fortune for European owners. It Africanized the region. But it made paradise a very difficult place for the most bulk of the population. Here's a couple of pictures. Oh, no, wrong way here. Here we go. Sugar prosperity. Look at sugar. I had no idea till I saw some of these pictures a few years ago how big sugarcane was. And here's the classic sugar mill, they call this, the grinding of it out. We'll have more of this later in the lecture, by the way. The great byproduct of sugar is what? Molasses. And the great byproduct of that is rum. It's a great thing when your byproduct gets as valuable as your product. You really can't go wrong. You take care of the crap, and it turns out to be worth selling as fertilizer. Okay, the next era would be the end of slavery, revolution, decline of sugar, that's relative decline, and the entrance of the United States. And this is primarily the 19th century. Now, why 1791? Why do we start there? Well, one of the biggest exports of the United States throughout its history, and by the way, a very noble export, has been the Declaration of Independence. And any American should be proud of that the Declaration is read almost everywhere. People are striving for something. Everywhere there's decolonization. And it's a glorious document, obviously, and it's had resonance around the world, not just to Americans. Okay, now, in 1791, the first revolution after the United States broke out in the Americas, and that was in Haiti. A slave who was an extraordinary-looking man, Toussaint Louverture. He looks regal there, doesn't he? He looks like a Napoleon or a European monarch. Led a rebellion in Haiti, beginning in 1791, and it took 13 years, but in 1804, a black republic was created. Now, the interesting thing is, this is the first republic after the United States in 1804 in the Americas. The rest of the Caribbean did not follow suit in general. The Declaration of Independence meant much more to Latin America. And by 1804, there were revolutions breaking out in the northern part, in Colombia, and the western part, in Mexico in 10 or 15 years. The Declaration of Independence had much more of a resonance in Latin America because most of the citizenry of the Caribbean were Africans who couldn't read and write, had little experience in doing these things, and had been terrified by their own raising. So the second revolution of the Caribbean was actually on the same island. That is, the other side of the island revolted against Haiti. So you had the first two republics are both on the same island of Espanola. But in general, it was not, the Declaration of Independence made a slower headway in the Caribbean than it did on land. The big success, though, was in abolitionism. And by 1848, all of slavery had been abolished. It came piecemeal, and interestingly, this is how it came about. The Caribbean landowners all resisted it. It was fought in Europe. The Dutch Empire abolished it in 1814 against the wishes of the Dutch owners in the Caribbean. The English Empire in 1834, the French in 1848, and always the battle was the same. Humanitarians at home, it's like getting rid of the encomienda. It's liberals at home, or people at home who don't want cruelty in their name, fighting against people who are actually carrying the cruelty out. But by 1848, it was abolished everywhere, except for the following, and this is really quite curious. Spain abolished slavery in 1811. Okay, good, but it made an exception for Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Santo Domingo. Now, those are big exceptions, most of the big Caribbean possessions. Yeah, we'll have none of that there except for this, not you, Schwartz. It's kind of a strange sort of thing. Slavery lasted in Cuba until 1886. Now, during this era, sugar stayed the #1 crop, but it became less and less profitable. It still was profitable, but it had competition. Brazil saw the money to be made, and India saw the money to be made, China saw the money to be made, and there's suddenly other competitors. So after 50 or 60 years, the Caribbean is still a major exporter of sugar, but not necessarily doesn't dominate the world in quite the same way. And all this time, American influence begins to grow in the area. It starts, by the way, in the 1820s. In the 1820s, if all of you learned this somewhere in your high school history class, something was promulgated called the Monroe Doctrine. It was written by John Quincy Adams, kind of a good quiz show. Who wrote the Monroe Doctrine? No, not Monroe. John Quincy Adams. He was the Secretary of State. Of course, Monroe blessed it and issued it. It issued in 1823, and what it more or less said was that the United States will not allow the free transfer of possessions among Europeans without its blessing. In other words, it more or less said the United States is saying if Europe wants to do things in the Americas, it has to consult the United States first. that we are the big, we are the big player here. We are the big kahuna in the Americas. Most of Europe, by the way, just laughed at this and dismissed it. But in truth, after 1823, American influence grew and grew and grew, and more European powers knew they had to respect this to some degree. This culminates in 1898. This culminates with the War of here. This is Cuba begging the United States, come give us your freedom, come give us your freedom. This is Cuba. This is very different than 1960, isn't it? You imagine this poster's not up anywhere in Havana right now. But the next era this era ends with the War of 1898. And in that, the United States declares war because Cuba's been involved in a civil war, a colonial war of independence for 30 years. The United States finally decides to intervene on the side of Cubans. It intervenes and declares war, and it captures Cuba, captures Puerto Rico, captures the Philippines, captures some other smaller Spanish possessions. It was, by the way, called at the time the 10-week war. From the declaration of war to the end of the war, the treaty, it was 10 weeks. They don't make wars like that anymore, do they? That was really quite something. Okay. The truth is, the United States, when it took possession of these, it said Cuba will be independent. It said because Cuba was fighting a war to get independence, the United States said within a couple of years it would declare Cuban independence. It would assist them. And in 1906, Cuba did become independent. Though from 1906 to 1959, it was primarily dominated by American interest. And Puerto Rico, the United States wasn't quite sure what to do. It claimed by the treaty that it now owned Puerto Rico, but no one really knew what that meant. No one knew, and by the way, what is this, 2018? No one knows what it means today, do they? It's been a very anomalous situation. Whether Puerto Rico should become independent, stay what it is, which is no basis in American law, really. Though a series of acts have been passed dealing with Puerto Rico, but it's always been a bit of a strange fish in American constitutional law. But what happens in 1898 is this ushers into the next era. Americans, bananas and pina coladas, banks and boats, 1898 to 1958. And by this I mean that the Americans now are clearly the dominant influence. A company is formed in 1899, a year after the war, called the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company becomes a government unto itself in Central America. It dominates local politics. It built, by the way, a string of huge hotels in the Caribbean and on the mainland. It becomes a super government arching over other countries. It's not as important in the Caribbean as it is on the mainland, but it's immensely important. And the first cruises, by the way, were banana boat cruises. United Fruit would send down banana boats, and they used to have 40 or 50 berths for Americans or others who wanted to go on these cruises and stay in the luxury hotels and see the world out here and have some warm weather. So the era of pina coladas starts after the War of 1898. I say banks and boats because some strange industries develop after this. One of them was banks. International banks started using various Caribbean islands because laws could be rigged or jigged or engineered to be somewhat lax, and money could be laundered or kept there, and Uncle Sam or the British Lion did not know where the money was. Other things were boats began being registered here. Over half the boats in the world now, commercial boats, are registered in the Caribbean and usually not subject to, I don't know where celebrities registered. Malta, okay. By the way, Malta is the only really independent country in the entire Mediterranean. There's kind of another. Well, Cyprus is complicated, isn't it? There's two countries claiming Cyprus. But the only truly independent, if we're comparing the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, the only truly independent country is Malta. I think it's got, what, 50,000 people? It's tiny, it is. And it sounds like a lovely place to live. But people began using the Caribbean for other exploitative purposes, banks and boats, and tourists just kept pouring in and pouring in. Okay. Now, why do I use 1958? Everyone knew after World War II, by the way, that the Caribbean would become decolonized. Everyone knew after World War II. By the way, the Caribbean played a very small role in World War I, played a huge role in World War II because of the Panama Canal. There were German U-boats everywhere in the Caribbean. There were battles, naval battles here. But everyone knew after World War II, the Caribbean, most of the big islands would become decolonized. And that at some point they would become independent, as would Asia, as would Africa. The problem with both the Caribbean and Asia and Africa is, while all the world can agree these places should be decolonized, the decolonization takes place in the middle of the Cold War, with various countries each trying to grab the old colonial possessions and play them off against each other. Most obviously in the Caribbean we have Cuba. Cuba becomes independent. which already was independent, but staged a revolution against the US-dominated government, and Cuba's been a thorn in the side of many countries and many peoples, and no one quite knows what to do since 1959. But 1958 is when the first independent Caribbean countries became. That was the Federation of the West Indies. And it's interesting because when that was put together, it doesn't exist today, the idea had Canada very much in mind. The idea was to build a Caribbean possession of all the English colonies, put them all together. That would be like a Canada, which is cobbled together of the English, the French, and Western Canada, the Hudson Bay Company possessions, or like Australia. Another big English country in the Caribbean. That lasted 4 years. The Federation lasted 4 years, and out of that came, I think, 7 independent countries. Most of the big ones we know, like Jamaica or Barbados. And after that, other countries started getting independent. We come down to the data we have now of 17 independent countries in the Caribbean. Now, where is the Caribbean now, as we look at it? In the last era. The last era would be, there's Pina Colada. This is 1946, Havana. That looks like a lot of fun, doesn't it? That looks nice. 1958 to 2018, okay. One of the big dominant factors in all of these years has been the Cuban Revolution. What to do with Cuba? Because, of course, Cuba wanted to export its revolution around the Caribbean and around Central America and as far as it could in these Latin American countries. It has not to much degree, but it has had an influence in many ways. And it's also influenced American foreign policy. American influence has waned in these years as countries become independent, but as recently as 1983, the United States invaded Grenada. So it's not entirely, obviously it's still the most important country in the area. European influence has also waned, but European countries still have outposts there. Now, Spain, interestingly enough, has not had a colony since 1898. Think back to that first Spanish lake, that first Spanish hegemony. But since 1898, Spain has been the non-player, but yet 60% of the Caribbean speak Spanish as their primary language. So to say Spain lost is true, but to say they won is also somewhat true. There are some really good signs here. The biggest sign I can say of happiness in the Caribbean is that the mortality rate. The mortality rate as measured in 2010 was 72. That's the life expectancy. The United States is around, I think, 77 for men, 79, 80 for women. Japan is even higher. But 72 is not bad. The relative gap between what the Caribbean used to be and the United States and Canada and England and the rest of the developed world was immense. This is not immense. It is narrowing. And if you take some countries out of it, which are really sad places like Haiti, it probably gets up to 74. So there are some really kind of good news stories. When you look at the GDP today of the Caribbean, there's some good news stories there. The Barbados has a GDP, average GDP, of 25,000. That's not bad. Aruba's 25,000. Barbados is 17,000. These are not bad GDPs. Adjusted for cost of living, it provides a reasonable standard of living. Puerto Rico was 35,000 in 2015. No one knows what it is now. You can't measure Puerto Rico now, and we won't be able to because of this anomalous condition it's in. But there have been some really good signs. Also, since World War II, the Caribbean has the highest rate of mobility for jobs, of any region in the world. They are more inclined to go from here to there to get a job than any other peoples in the world. Now, the present stats say the following. Haiti is 95% of African ancestry. Jamaica, 92%. At the other end, Cuba is 64% white European. Puerto Rican, 75% white European. None of these data are to be believed. I mean, they indicate something, but how do you say what you are? I ask you, and you tell me. Bigotry comes into the self-definition of all of this, but the truth is some islands seem very Africanized, some seem much, much less so and still very Hispanic and much more European. I would end by saying two things. One, there is no measurable Indian population in the Caribbean if you look at groups, not 1%. If you look at DNA, substantial. So it means that the Africans and the Hispanics and the other Europeans have in their bloodstream native blood, but there's no group that approaches 1% anywhere in any of the countries or dependencies that calls themselves native. One thing I want to end on is a strange little happy note, and I bet it'll speak to some of you. It is that the Caribbean has the highest percentage of medical schools of any region in the world. There are 60 fully accredited medical schools in this little region of the world. The entire United States, with 325 million people, has 141. the ratio is stunning in that. One goes to the 19th century, one goes to 1948, a few go to the 1960s, in Cuba primarily. Most are since 1980, and they are accredited. Most of you have been to a doctor somewhere in New York or Minnesota or California who has a medical degree from a Caribbean school. A lot are sponsored by English or American universities also. They're in partnership. One is by a South Korean university. It just strikes me as a particularly ingenious way of making money, of saying, you want to go to med school in a warm place where you can snorkel all day and you know, and the tuition is really low? Come to the Caribbean. There's a certain kind of, I think, healthy quality to that. And if you look around at the Caribbean today, I think there's real reason for optimism. But it's been a long slog. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Am I intruding on your time? A little, okay. Okay, I'm intruding already on the next gentleman here, who's a lot funnier than I am, and so you should stay. It's a history of comedy. When I come back tomorrow, ask questions about this to start off, okay? If you have questions, bring them in tomorrow, and we'll start with them. Thank you very much. No, that's not mine. That's here. Thank you. Questions tomorrow. Oh. How are you?
Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, thank you. That makes me feel good. Thank you. Ooh. Oh. Oh. Mm. Oh. I'll set an alarm tomorrow and be out earlier. I'm sorry. Thank you. Ooh. I'm all tangled up here. Yes. Thank you, good. Thank you much. Okay. Whoops.
I don't need that. I'm 14 here. I bring my own.